She called it thrift store chic. It wasn't even a joke. It was a prop, lobbed across a polished conference table to mark the distance between someone who owned an unexamined inheritance and someone who had earned every late night, every spreadsheet, every apology she never asked for. Rebecca Hson felt the word settle on her knuckle like an accusation. The ring, thin, worn, the gold dulled by years of being unnoticed, caught the fluorescent light and answered with a small, private glint. It was the kind of thing the office could ignore until someone chose to point at it, then everyone agreed to look as if they'd noticed all along. "Thrift store chic," Leela Lang said, smiling the way you do at a costume you know you haven't paid for. The room laughed in the polite, slightly cruel rhythm of modern meetings, a few sharp chuckles from the table, the almost bark from Richard Lang that meant nothing but wanted to mean everything, the chorus of phones going back to sleep. Rebecca kept her hands folded, thumb rubbing the inside edge of the ring until the metal warmed. Her voice didn't rise, her face didn't move. There were ways to be visible without being seen. Rebecca had learned them the hard way. You could make spreadsheets that removed bottlenecks, email in the middle of the night so crises dissolved by morning, or staff the same names into presentations until your fingerprints were worn smooth on everyone else's success. You could become the thing that kept the machinery from seizing, an invisible oil that smelled only if you lifted the machine's casing. It was the safest place to hide, for years, until someone with a loud laugh and a disposable salary decided to demonstrate the difference between style and history. The meeting had started ordinary. Monday strategy, coffee that tasted of exhaustion, the familiar slide deck with its optimistic arrows. The firm liked to call these sessions alignment. It was an honest name if you didn't mind the suggestion that everything out of place was personal failure. Leela arrived in a dress that used 2 different florals and 3 different networks of entitlement. Her father sat 2 rows back with the sort of blank composure entitled men bring to earned compliments. Richard Lang watched her perform, an almost proud, almost distant spectator at his own succession plan. Rebecca's part was logistical. Integrate the new client feed, tidy the vendor ladder, make sure the numbers across 3 time zones reconciled without anyone noticing the reconciliation had been the labor of someone's overnight solitude. She did it well. They noticed the results and never the person. Her reward was a string of small indignities and 1 large meta-compliment. "You're difficult," a euphemism for, "You make us ask hard questions we don't want to answer." "Thrift store chic," Leela repeated, softer now, as if the joke had been threaded through her teeth and come out cleaner the second time. "It's cute, like vintage."
"Where'd you get it? A charity shop on your lunch break?" The point was not the ring. The point was the audience. The point was to remind Rebecca that she occupied a particular place in the room, near the pipes, allowed circuitous respect, never the light. The point was to shore up Leela's performance by tearing at the seams of someone's quiet dignity. There was a calculation to it. Entitlement isn't loud because it's raw. It's loud because it must force people to notice. No one leaned to defend Rebecca. That would have been messy. Instead, the conversation moved on like a tide covering a stone. Over, indifferent. But small things have memory. The ring's glint was a photograph that some men with good memories learned to carry. If you want to see how one quiet person rewrites a firm's history, hit subscribe and stay with the story. This one doesn't end with a punchline. After the meeting, people shuffled out like shuffled cards. Names, phrases, obligations restacked for the week. Rebecca collected her notes with her usual careful fingers, the single breath she allowed herself before the treadmill resumed. She could have left. She could have let the insult be air. Most days she did. But there are small, habitual gestures you never quite lose. She touched the ring, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and walked to the elevator. Elias' work was mid-hallway, a figure more often felt than seen by most. He carried his power like a coat. It was tailored, heavy, and kept him warm through the seasons of company panic. When he noticed the ring, the elevator door hadn't yet closed. He paused with the sort of neat indecision that makes people around you pretend they don't see you consider whether to speak. Rebecca moved with the deliberate pace of someone who knew the rhythm of the building. 3 steps, a soft turn, shoulders angled just so when the glare off the marble tried to show the wrong face. She didn't expect the pause. The pause is its own language. It can be a crack in conversation where truth slips through, or a mirror in which someone recalibrates. Work's pause was small, professional. It tugged at something Rebecca had been told to keep secret. Work's gaze cut to the ring and refolded the hallway's air. A man like him carried an attention that felt like a currency all its own, paid in interest, withdrawn in calamity. He didn't say anything. He rarely said things that were not useful, but he had seen the ring before. He could place it to a lineage with fewer pieces than the firm had numbers in its search fields. The instant memory of a seal, a thin band bearing a mark from a man who made his name before most of them were born. That man was Edmund Hson. Jamie used to joke that the Hson name was like a weather pattern, predictable, slow, and often devastating when it arrived. Rebecca didn't joke about her father.
He'd been a ghost in the firm for years, not an absentee man so much as an archive, ledgers, signatures, quiet decisions recorded in a hand that had once saved them at their most desperate. The rumors were part history, part talisman. Edmund H. Hson had been the kind of financier who bailed out companies when the market whimpered. He worked behind legalese and pastry orders, placing money in quiet envelopes so that a company could make payroll after a catastrophic quarter. He was the winter coat you hoped never to have to borrow, because it meant someone had burned down the house. If Rourke's attention on the ring caused a ripple, it started as a pebble. Rebecca felt it go through the floorboards. She felt the building inhale and misplace its papers. Elevator doors clacked, a coffee cup was set down with extra care, and under the fluorescent hum, the office rearranged itself for a problem that hadn't yet arrived. Later that afternoon, her manager, an affable man with a talent for avoiding conflict by asking too many questions, sent an invitation to the HR suite, a gentle place with plants and a clock running 5 minutes slow. Rebecca knew the pattern. She'd seen colleagues pass through the door with different outcomes: a severance envelope, a promotion that blurred their shoulders into a different posture, or a quiet negotiation where one's loyalty was traded for a reimagined loyalty to the company brand. The word difficult had become a ticket in someone else's hand, a polite notice that said, in corporate terms, "We can no longer deal with you." "There's a perception issue," Karen from HR said, which is how people in soft lighting say we're preparing to let you go. She had a folder and a kindness practice to the point of being institutional. Rebecca listened to the script the way you listen to weather. It's inevitable, and you prepare accordingly. "We've had a number of concerns," Karen continued, voice calibrated to minimize bruises. "You raise questions. You don't always play well with others. We appreciate your contributions, Rebecca, but there are optics to consider." The room smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and a coffee someone had abandoned. Reed, the manager, sat to the side and rubbed his temples. He was the kind of middle manager that tried to be everyone's alarm clock and failed. Rebecca said nothing at first. She had answers that didn't need to be spoken in the room that stank of conformity. She could have argued the immorality of conflating competence with insolence. She could have cataloged the times she'd fixed problems Richard Lang created before he noticed they existed. She could have asked why Leela's hands were always full to the brim with praise and not responsibility. She didn't. Instead, she reached into her bag and put the ring, now worn like a memory, on the table in front of Karen. It made a polite, dull sound. For a second, the lemon and fabric of the conference chair receded. The ring said what she had not. Karen blinked. "Do you want to—" she started. Rebecca let the moment hang like a calibration. "Let's make sure the record is complete," she said. Her voice was a small surgical instrument, precise and calm. "If you're considering the optics, consider this. My father, Edmund H. Hson, has a founding role still recorded in the firm's original agreements. If you're planning action, be certain you know what you're acting upon." That was not what Karen had expected. She held the "We Understand" folder the same way you hold a fragile thing. "We can review the documents." "It wouldn't hurt," Rebecca interrupted softly, "for compliance to review the archives." She didn't need to explain more. People in lemon rooms always underestimate what the archives hold, because archives are boring until they start to move. By the time she walked out, the elevator hummed like a contained insect. She considered the idea of being called difficult as a prelude to being sacked. There are forms of dismissal that resemble the turning off of a light: sudden, efficient, administratively neat. There are other dismissals that are quieter and duller, with paperwork rather than shouting. Rebecca preferred the second for the fact it left more awake neighbors to watch what happens next. The ripple became a current the moment Rourke decided to step off it. He didn't make declarations in hallways. He didn't author op-eds or deliver ultimatums from his private jet. He sat in rooms with chairs that matched his suit and asked questions in calm tones, so that the person being questioned often volunteered the rest. He could, in the end, do something that looked remarkably like withdrawing his warmth. And when he did, stories ended badly for the men who relied on warmth like seasoning. She didn't know work was going to move. No one ever knew, until a meeting that altered the calendar of other people's lives. But she knew that if he noticed a thing, it rarely stayed unnoticed. The office began to smell different after that. New coffee, an edge of bleach, whispers that hovered like dust. People started to ask each other if they'd seen the slug of an email from compliance that no one mentioned in open chat. Phones buzzed like nervous animals. An assistant in one wing typed with such focus people in the stairwell could hear her nails arrange sentencings. It was a modern thing, panic disguised as competence. A courier arrived the next morning. Gray coat, neutral shoes, a box the color of old money. These deliveries were small theater. Someone who moves paperwork like it's a confession. The envelope inside bore a seal stamped in wax, a crest Rebecca knew without thinking. The Hson seal wasn't flamboyant. It was the kind of thing a man who preferred accounts to applause with design. Precise, slightly officious, the kind of sign that meant someone had the billfold to back up their voice. Leela saw the envelope and thought of social media captions. Richard saw it and thought of control.
The assistants saw it and thought of vacation possibilities. Only a few people saw the shape of what a sealed ledger could do. Not magic, but a mechanical truth. Paper that had weight. A clause that read like ballast. The founding documentation. The kind of thing that, when produced in the right place, rearranged meetings faster than any newsletter. Rebecca watched the handoff from a distance. The courier slipped the envelope into the chair where Delgado, the chairwoman, would sit tomorrow. The chair has a way of making men smaller. Perhaps it is the authority of a seat. Delgado's office was full of calibrated silence. She was the kind of leader who made decisions sound like natural events, inevitable and slightly cold. She liked documents that were heavy. The first ripple became an undercurrent that moved people who had pretended not to notice into making small, consequential decisions. The head of compliance called a meeting no one wanted to attend. Jenna from compliance moved through the corridors with a gravity that suggested she was carrying a new set of facts. Alan, who was nominally the guy who handled internal audits, started asking for spreadsheets that had not been audited in 3 years. Their language shifted from vague to specific, like a choir tuning to a key. Rebecca did what she always did in crises. She watched. She watched how men adjusted their collars when power moved through air like current. She watched Leela post a photo of an office plant on social media with a caption about big energy and thought of the smallness of that idea. She watched Richard try to be sad without admitting fear. She watched her colleagues reconfigure conversations so that the subject of her disappearance was a bureaucratic eventuality. Rourke arranged a private meeting, the sort of let's have a quick coffee that never is quick and never actually is about coffee. It was in a glass-walled corner of the building that smelled faintly of citrus and old decisions. He spoke first, like he preferred to, quietly, with enough intention that every syllable might be unpacked if you were interested. "That ring," he said, nodding toward her hand. The words were ordinary, but the air they carried was not. Boxen. Rebecca observed the tilt of his head. He didn't need to ask for the story. Men like Rourke keep a ledger of associations in the creases of their expression. The fact that he pronounced the name was an authorization for the room to listen in. "You know the history?" she asked. She had been careful in the HR suite not to explain too much. There is a discipline to leaving your options on the table without setting them down like tools people can pick up and injure themselves with. "I know enough," he said. Boxen was discreet. He didn't like theater, but he made choices. He folded his hands as if to keep them from making promises. "Are you planning to make one of those choices now?" Rebecca asked. The question was a lever. She didn't expect him to pull it. She asked because asking is a way of watching the muscles in a man's face for signs of decision-making. Rourke smiled a fraction that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm not a man of theatrics either," he said, "but I do pay attention to signals." He turned the phrase into a soft threat and a promise at once. "You understand this building runs on confidence, Miss Hson. You either shore it or you bury it." The briefness of his sentence carried something like a contract. It was not an instruction to act. It was a notice that he had the capacity to do so. That capacity held weight because work had been known to move things, funds, priorities, alliances, by simply making a presence felt in the right room. He could, without swagger, choose not to extend the warmth that allowed otherwise fragile executives to stand before the press. He was the kind of figure who could put a company's reputation into quarantine with his silence. Rebecca didn't smile back. She tucked her hands into the pockets of her coat like someone putting their tools away for the night. "I'm not here to make the firm feel bad," she said. "I'm here so it functions as advertised." They both knew how that read through the building. That was the point. She needed to be more visible if she was to ensure the firm did not, as people feared, dissolve into unproductive panic. She also knew that Rourke's recognition of the ring was a new variable in a room built on settled certainties. Between the HR talk and the elevator pause, between the courier and Elena's whisper in the stairwell, the firm began to breathe differently. The old halls have ways of remembering past lifelines and calling them forth when they are needed. People whose names never left the lower rungs of credits suddenly found themselves being asked to recall the year an emergency loan had kept payroll liquid. They'd be asked to dig into archives and dust off spreadsheets marked confidential. They were being invited to remember a man who used to be a ghost and was now very, very relevant. Rebecca's phone buzzed with a message from an anonymous number. "We need to talk." It was the digital equivalent of a paper being slid under a door. The sender was careful, cryptic enough to be plausible. She didn't reply. Whoever had sent it had already probably done the thing they wanted done, make certain people in certain chairs uncomfortable. People like her were dangerous because they knew how to make institutions uneasy with the truth. The trick was to do it without the truth becoming melodrama. When the sealed envelope finally reached the chair in Delgado's office, it was like a stage direction. It didn't move people to immediate action. The action would be gradual, legal, and precise. It rearranged priorities. It changed how language was used in meetings. It brought compliance memos into conversations with a ferocity they hadn't had before.
It put a kind of nervous energy into calls that had always been predictable. At the center of the shift was a thing with teeth, a clause sewn into the firm's founding, a legacy provision that could not be ignored by a board that liked to call itself prudent. No clause is an answer all by itself. Paper alone doesn't topple men, but it's a mechanism, and mechanisms in a corporate setting can be as lethal as gossip when they are operated by the right people. Word traveled in the way corporate things do. Emails without subject lines, Slack threads titled with innocuous words like review and archive, and a series of calendar holds that suggested a meeting might become more than just talk. Jenna sent a compliance update that began, "Please note, an archival document has been presented for review." The line was bland enough to be functional and precise enough to worry people who had spent months hoping nothing in the archives would ever be opened. Richard tried to make jokes in corridors. They fell flat. He raised the subject of optics in a private call and used the kind of words executives use when they think language is a cushion. He couldn't make his voice sound like certainty. Leela continued to smile for cameras as if the world were a column in her favor, but you could see the tension in the way her fingers tightened around the stem of a water glass. Rebecca, for her part, continued to be what she had always been, unobtrusive and efficient. People misread calm as passivity. They were wrong. She'd spent months collecting information that looked like inert matter, a list of where original signatures were kept, an index of founding documents, the times the founder had stepped in with a discretionary fund that never made it to the annual report. The pieces were not dramatic in themselves. Their drama lay in how they fit together. There was a discrete ping on an internal system Rebecca had access to, nothing that would survive an audit as a smoking gun, but it was enough for her to confirm something. She didn't elaborate on the method. That would be both redundant and unhelpful. She simply closed the window and made a note. Confirm seal authenticity. Schedule a conversation with a neutral counsel. No drama. She preferred the clarity of a plan. That afternoon, a small group gathered in the usual place where people who make policy met, a boardroom with glass walls and chairs that understood their gravity. They talked economy as if it were a weather pattern. Forecasts were exchanged, seasonal pressures noted, strategies described in the calm language of people who believe they are doing the right thing. But there were fissures in their language. Certain words were used now like umbrellas: fiduciary, legacy, compliance review. Men shifted in their chairs when the archive was mentioned. That was all the clue Rebecca needed that the next move would be procedural and public, not theatrical. She didn't plant herself at the center. She moved like a shadow to the edges and listened to the talk as if it were an instrument she could tune. People mentioned Henderson without melodrama, like a surgeon mentioning a type of suture. That made the conversation more dangerous because it was cool and methodical. Richard's voice carried that afternoon, with a tone that tried to borrow conviction. "We can handle this," he said, more to himself than to anyone. He had the executive reflex to put out crises with a set of larger gestures. He wanted to stage a defense, to call up allies and reminders of past loyalty. It wouldn't be the sort of lesson that made history. It would be the sort that made him feel less small. Not everyone believed him. Malcolm Brandt, the company's founder and its last bastion of sentimental loyalty, watched his hands curl around a glass and then relax as if he'd already made a decision he wasn't yet ready to say out loud. Chairwoman Delgado's face had the unruffled quality of someone who saw paper for what it was, both tool and weapon. "It will come down to documentation," Delgado said finally, the words thin and clear as glass. "We follow governance, we notify council, and we act within the charter." Charter, Rebecca thought. She had the odd sensation of being a category in a document she had once been peripheral to. The only time an invisible hand becomes visible is when the machinery requires it. By late afternoon, the building hummed with a particular kind of efficiency, the unspectacular movement of corporate life being rearranged. Phones buzzed, memos were drafted, and work, quietly, effectively, set a motion in place that would make a lot of people walk a new line. An investor discretion notification. It was a phrase that could mean many things, and the way he wielded it made people change their presentations and tidy their talking points. Rebecca wasn't naive about whether the firm would claw back the moment. She knew that men like Lang played to preserve themselves. She also knew that men like Rourke didn't act without cause. That left her in a peculiar position, between the slow, institutional apparatus of governance and the quick, decisive motion of capital. She'd always been better at the slow parts. They left room for precision. But whoever controls the quick motion in a firm often wins the narrative. The envelope still sat in Delgado's office like a small, patient animal. It would be opened with gloves, discussed with counsel, and turned into minutes that would linger in people's inboxes for months. But the opening would be a ceremony of normalcy, and normalcy in such hands is usually fatal to negligence. Rebecca, that evening, sat at a cafe not far from the building and watched people who had no idea what had shifted move through the city as if their day were ordinary. She sipped coffee that tasted of burned ambition and tried to imagine what equilibrium meant now.
The ring, tucked safely beneath her finger, felt less like a family heirloom than a contract waiting to be read aloud. When the courier's wax seal was finally examined in private, there would be an answer inside. It would not be a simple act of revenge, and it would not be spectacle. It would be corrective, an audit that preferred adjustments to vengeful furies. That was how Rebecca liked to think of justice, an instrument that fixes balance, painfully and methodically, without theatrics. She believed in legibility, a consequence that could be recorded in minutes and checked by counsel. There were people in the building who would be broken by that kind of consequence. There were people who would be furious, who would call it spite. They would miss the point. Her aim was not to destroy so much as to clear a ledger. The firm's ethos, she believed, should be coherent with the way it presented itself. If those above it had used it as a ladder for heirs and entitlement, then the ladder needed an inspection. That night there was an email. Subject line, urgent, archival verification. The sender was Channa. It was written in the language compliance uses when they know they have something. Spare, procedural, without flourish. There was a line in it that made the building's air tighten. Please be advised a founding document has been presented for verification. Between the line and the signature, attention shifted. People who had thought their jobs were quiet left their desks and walked toward the conference rooms. Phones lit up with messages, moved with the kind of speed that had none of the actor's drama but all of the engineer's precision. Rebecca read Jenna's email and felt a small, professional satisfaction. She had not set any of the brass in motion. She had only exposed the ledger to light. The work of governance would now proceed. Council would be involved. The board would convene. And the firm would begin its own audit. That was the thing about institutions. They liked their processes because the processes protected them. The processes would be the instrument of accountability if people chose to wield them rather than hide behind them. She left the cafe and walked back through the city, heels on pavement that responded with a metronome of clicks. The building's lights pulsed like a heartbeat she had always felt from the inside. The ring was warm in her pocket.
It had been a quiet thing for years. Now it had a pulse of its own. In the stairway, someone whispered, "They say it's Hson." The words felt like a warning bell. Rebecca smiled once, almost inaudibly, like someone who had made a small, precise incision and was waiting to see how the patient would respond. No one in the building believed she would accept a seat on the board if it were offered. They like to think people want power the way children want toys, glossy, loud, and easily broken. She didn't.
Power, in her experience, was actuarial. A tool you used, or an archive you left unmolested. She was not greedy. She was exact. And somewhere on the 11th floor, Richard Lang drafted a memo that tried to combine charm and control, and failed. He scripted his lines to reassure investors, and started sentences with the words, "We understand the sensitivity." In that room, the same men who had once written checks for lunch now worried about the shape of a signature, and how a legacy clause could turn from historical footnote into main event. The winter of tiny gestures had begun. People adjusted their suits, the assistants rehearsed their faces, the counsel had their pens ready. A company's story can change in the space between a ring's glint and a sealed envelope. Rebecca had no appetite for spectacle. She wanted accuracy, and for an institution to be obliged to account for the ways it had once acted without full sight. She walked back into the building feeling as if she were walking into a machine she knew how to tune. The risk was that when the clock moved, it could move catastrophically. The gain was that when it did, a man who thought himself untouchable might find his chair unsteady. At the elevator, a young analyst tried to intercept her. "Are you okay?" he asked, the kind of question that tastes like discomfort when you answer honestly. "I'm fine," she said, "but careful of how you measure other people's things." The words were small, exact, and would carry. As the doors slid closed, she caught sight of Leela in the reflection, fingers preening at her hair, a face that wanted to be triumphant even as the room shifted under her. For the first time, the smile was slightly unsure. The reflection made Leela look smaller than she thought she was. Rebecca let the elevator take her up. The ring sat at her finger like a promise. She had been called difficult for speaking up. The label had been wielded as a kind of social scalpel. She had been told that difficulty cost you your place at the table. She had been told more recently that invisibility was the price of making systems work. If you had told her 2 weeks earlier that a man's pause in a hallway could be the first honest thing an institution felt in years, she would have said you were being dramatic. She had always preferred to be accurate. Tonight, the building hummed with a different kind of energy. The archive had been unsealed, and a man with the habit of moving money had noticed a worn band of gold. The stage was set for formalities. People prepared for legalities. Men who had relied on warmth began to recalibrate the language of power. Rebecca did not rejoice. She watched. She had the patience of someone who knew that once you open a clause, you must be ready to read every line. Her role was to ensure the reading happened, and that the firm had to answer in the language of governance, not gossip. That, she believed, was accountability, not spectacle, not vengeance. She kept her hands folded and let the machine prepare itself to act. The quiet of her composure was not neutrality, it was an instrument. When people try to take away your place by slapping a label across your chest, the most effective answer sometimes isn't shouting, but making sure the record is complete. A meeting request popped on her phone, with a sender she recognized by reputation, if not by name. Rourke, calendar notice, private, discussion. The time was vague. He had chosen a place that said little and meant much. That was how you knew this was no longer small. The next day, the board's schedule shifted. The chairwoman added an emergency slot with a sort of indifference only someone who has the power to rearrange other people's time could have. People started talking about reputational impact with the sort of earnestness that usually precedes capitulation. Rebecca sat at her desk and opened a file she'd kept for years, a ledger of small favors, a list of times the firm's books had been lubricated by a hand that never demanded a headline. The ring burned warm on her finger. She felt for a moment the odd combination of grief and propriety that comes when history has to be untangled. Edmund Hunterson had never wanted credit. He'd preferred the quiet efficiency of being useful. If the ledger had to be loud, she'd prefer it to be neat. There was a volley of messages across the building. HR checking in with managers, compliance asking for access credentials, and a terse note from counsel suggesting a confidentiality line. It read like the beginning of a chess game where everyone thought they were 5 moves ahead.
Rebecca had never been interested in being admired. She was interested in ensuring that the ledger matched the law. At noon, as seasons of attention turned in men and women who had once believed reputation was a smell you could buy, Ellis Brandt called a meeting with the founder. Brandt had spent decades watching people craft a company and then attempt to claim its future as if it were a family plate. He was tired in a way that makes people decisive. His voice carried a certain regret when Richard Lang's name came up. "We can't let the company become a family heirloom," he said, "not if it's being used for privilege." The words had a clarity that could be felt in the bones of a room. Privilege had been a soft place Richard and Leela had folded themselves into. Now it had become an accusation written in the thin, official paper of governance. When Rebecca walked back through the hallways that evening, the air felt like the last calm before a storm that had paperwork instead of lightning. She rounded the corner and saw Rourke, deliberate as always, standing beneath the portrait of the building's founder. He offered her a nod like a concession to history. "We should speak," he said. She agreed.
She had always known what a conversation with him might sound like. Short lines, precise sentences, questions that operated like scalpel tips. She also knew that his attention had already moved the furniture in rooms she frequented. That was both useful and dangerous. They walked to the glassed corner where conversations were private by light, and he leaned forward with the kind of interest that feels like it might open a safe. The ring caught the light and sent it back the way a small, exact mirror does. Rourke's reaction was minimal, professional, but it was the kind of minimal that rearranged meetings, the kind of professional that had the power to call an investor's bluff and win. "You understand," he said, "that this could get messy." "I understand," she replied. "Messy is different from unjust." He smiled then, a small thing that did not carry warmth. "No," he said, "it is." As they spoke, a courier in a gray coat left a package at Delgado's door. A man at compliance drafted a memo that would soon be the first page of minutes. And in a corner office, Malcolm Brandt folded his hands and wondered how much of the company's moral spine he wanted to expose. Rebecca straightened, wrapped her coat around her, and fingered the ring once more. It fit like a memory. She had been dismissed for being difficult once, politely and without theatrics. She had shown them the ledger. She had given the building a choice: act by its own charter, or let the loud and the entitled keep rewriting history with their voices. There were many ways this could end. Some would end in spectacle. Some would end in legalities and minutes and press releases. Rebecca did not hunger for the spectacular. She wanted to be sure the company's story matched its purported values. Her father's ring would be the instrument that ensured the story was read, not as an act of revenge, but as an audit. She left the conversation with work with no promises made aloud, only consequences implied. The courier's red wax would be broken in private. Minutes would be read by lawyers. The board would have to choose. Men who had called her difficult would have to answer in the language they pretended to revere. And in the hallway, as she made her carefully ordinary exit, she heard Leela laugh at something cruel and small. Rebecca thought about all the times women were told their directness was a fault, and men were told their entitlement a right. She felt no anger so much as a cold commitment to getting the record straight. Outside, the city breathed on and off like a machine with little confidence in its own motion. The ring warmed to her skin. She put it back on because some objects insist on the body as much as memory insists on the mind. The building would rearrange itself slowly now. Paper would be moved, counsel would be consulted, friends would be called, and people would make bets on what would survive. But the first and most honest act had already happened. Attention had been paid, and attention in a room that likes to pretend it never looks is a powerful engine. She walked home with the knowledge that she had not dismantled anything. She'd set in motion a process. That process would either correct the system or confirm its rot. That was the test. She wasn't sure which outcome the firm wanted, but she knew which outcome she wanted. Not spectacle, not vengeance, but accountability. And somewhere in the glassy building, someone would open the envelope and read the name on the page. The seal would have weight. The clause would have teeth. For a long time, the firm's narrative had been performed for cameras and aspiration. Tonight, the narrative might be forced into the hard light of documents. She slept with the ring on, as if protection were something you could physically hold against the night. The next morning, the firm moved like a creature that had been poked under the ribs, slow at first, then accelerating toward an instinct it hadn't admitted it had. Rebecca arrived to find a note slipped under her door, official, polite, and designed to bruise with the least visible scuff. An email flagged personnel action and a printed letter waiting in HR. They had made the administrative part of it tidy. They had, in short, tried to be surgical.
Effective immediately, the letter read in the clinical font HR preferred, "We are terminating your employment." It included the soft amenities corporations use to fold people out of their days, a severance offer, a non-disparagement paragraph, a final checklist. It did not include the look in Richard Lang's eyes when he said he'd had enough of disruptive behavior and that a firm needed people who smoothed, not pricked, its skin. Leela had posted a congratulatory emoji in a private group. The memo was a public artifice for a private sentiment. Rebecca, who had spent years learning to let other people's decisions land without giving them the satisfaction of volatility, read the letter in her inbox like a prescription she'd taken before. She signed nothing. She put the paper on her desk as if it were an interesting object, a specimen to be catalogued, and she continued breathing at her measured pace. There are many kinds of dismissals. Some are dramatic and televised. Others are so administratively perfect you barely notice the door closing behind you until you turn for a coat and it's gone. This one had been designed to be quiet. Her badge swiped, and for a single bureaucratic moment, failed. The little red light blared at the receptionist. "Access revoked," the kiosk said, with the indifference of a machine doing its job. An assistant hovered near the elevator with a walkie-talkie. Someone in security had instructions. People who had spent the morning adjusting their faces to the new morning's narrative now saw that one of the pieces had been removed as they had planned. "Miss
Hson?" Karen from HR asked, voice practiced and soft in a way that managed to make policies sound like consolation. "We're going to escort you out while we process the offboarding." It would have been easy to let them do it. It would have been easy for her to be led through corridors where people pretended not to look. There is dignity in refusal, too, not in spectacle, but in the quiet act of choosing what story you let be told about you. She pushed her chair back and set the printed letter in front of Karen, the same way she had put the ring on the table, because gestures that insist on attention can be useful tools. "I appreciate the paperwork," she said, "but before any escort, please confirm counsel has seen the archive material presented yesterday." Karen blinked. The blink was the same kind of pause Rebecca had watched work take in the hallway, micro, but able to reorder a meeting. "We will follow process," Karen said, as if she'd been given a script with the word contingent in the margin. "Good," Rebecca said, "because if termination is executed without full review of the Hson legacy clause, it could be procedurally premature." The sentence had the effect of a small, polite bomb in a room that prized scripts. They proceeded with the formality. A security officer, efficient and not unkind, stood up as if to offer a courtesy she neither asked for or needed. He extended his hand in the way people do when they mean to maintain distance. Rebecca slid the printed letter into the folder she'd brought. Neat, recorded. And as she walked through the corridor, she kept eyes that catalogued, not flinched. The firm wanted to believe it was removing an irritant. It was instead arresting a detail it had not yet accounted for. As security guided her toward the reception, a courier arrived in the lobby with the measured punctuality of someone who delivers calendared events rather than surprises. He carried a small box, the kind executives receive when the day requires a certain gravity. He asked for Delgado. An assistant signed for the package with the deference routine commands require. The wax on the seal caught the lobby skylight and sent a small band of shadow across the marble. 10 feet away, a man in a suit with a different kind of authority watched the exchange with minimal expression. Elias Rook. Rook's phone pinged with a calendar notification. He did not need the reminder. The courier's presence was the kind of signal his world noticed before the machines caught up. He stood, adjusted the angle of his collar as if tuning a radio, and walked toward the board suite with a gait that acknowledged people while not asking for their attention. When he passed Rebecca, their eyes met. He did not smile. The acknowledgement was sufficient. Inside Delgado's office, with counsel already on a conference line, the seal was broken with gloved hands, and the founding document was laid on the table like a proposition.
The wax left a print that looked like a punctuation mark. The boardroom fell into a particular silence people only use when a fact is capable of changing votes. Richard Lang had been preparing his own defense script, optics, continuity, a pitch of "we will weather this." He had circulated talking points and rallied allies with the kind of manic charm that looks like confidence until you count the hands sweating. When the document was presented, his hands went small. He looked for the speech that would make paper irrelevant and found that paper, particular paper, was the one thing Lang could not override with bluster. Delgado read aloud what the founding clause said in the firm's dry legalese, a legacy provision that explicitly recognized the Hson family as a protective interest, with a mechanism allowing the board to request immediate review and to act when an heir's protection was implicated.
The clause did not grant absolute authority to any Hson descendant. It did, however, create an obligation. Governance had to consider the Hson interest as a fiduciary matter. Legal counsel clarified the text with tempered diction, careful to avoid drama but precise enough to force the day into a new grammar. There is a particular sound in a room when the ground under someone's chair shifts, a chair leg scraping, a throat clearing, an expression attempting to code itself into something sturdier than fear. Richard Lang tried to smile and find proximity in the narrative he'd prepared, misunderstandings, optics, internal culture, but the air had changed into a smaller, more technical language, breaches of compliance, undocumented decisions, conflicts of interest. Someone slid a spreadsheet across the table. Numbers made the room colder. Work spoke then, not loudly, but with the kind of clarity that carries across counsels. I've reviewed the materials presented. The risk profile has changed materially. Those words in a private boardroom were a different sort of instruction. He didn't say, "I'll withdraw," like a tantrum. He said something far more consequential. "We will proceed with discretion." Discretion is a tool often used to soften the edges of capital, but Work's kind of discretion can be absolute. Counsel, having read the clause and performed their quiet arithmetic, advised the board that, given the Hson interest and the governance obligations, moving forward with an immediate public action was the prudent path. That path required a vote. Lang tried once more to claim the moral high ground. He rose, hands wide as if to cradle the room. "This is manufactured," he said, voice thick with a fatherly chord he had cultivated to distract. "We've built something real here. We can't let history or family names undo years of hard work." "Hard work isn't a shield," Delgado replied, flat and cold. "Hard work is documentation. We are a company that answers to its charters." Her eyes passed over Lang like a final assessment rather than a condemnation.
The board voted. The count was clinical, each hand raising a measured degree of certainty. Malcolm Brandt, who had spent a lifetime guarding memory against its misuse, found himself voting with an expression that had room for regret. The motion carried. The board would request Lang step aside pending an independent review and appoint an interim leader to stabilize operations. It was not an immediate ceremonial removal. Governance tends to avoid theatrics. But it was a rupture. It was a public sentence delivered with the procedural language of insurance. Outside the room, the firm's communications team, on standby for PR that might require lipstick over bruises, began to draft a press release. Their sentences were careful, designed to sound like steadiness and not panic, pursuing governance processes, committed to transparency, cooperating with counsel. They sent the first lines for approval through a chain of signatures that now included a trustee Work requested be involved. The press release, when it went out, would carry weight not because of what it said, but because of who had consented to it. Work did not make a theatrical exit. He did not have to. He issued a statement in the kind of language institutional investors respect. "We are reallocating our strategic position pending governance clarity." It was a sentence with the teeth of finance. It was not an explicit withdrawal. It did not have to be. Markets and boards respond to tone as much as to direct orders. The statement was enough to cause counterparties to adjust their assumptions and to force CFOs into reevaluating forecasts in daylight. The effect was immediate. Counterparties whispered, lines of credit were re-examined, and a number usually abstract, commitment levels, undisclosed exposure, went from theoretical to actionable. In the lobby, HR's escorting protocol met Work's motion. Spokespeople began to prepare to tell the market a story that would stabilize by evincing process. Lang discovered with the slow horror of a man losing a script he had relied on that his allies were thin when the ledger of trust heightened. Those who had once smiled at his jokes now made careful, neutral faces and photographs. Leela, who had treated the firm like a stage, had less control than she'd believed. Her father made calls down a line that no longer accepted bluster as a currency. Her image on social channels was already being archived. Rebecca watched the micro-movements with the calm of someone reading a sheet of ledger paper. She had been fired in form, if not in effect. She had been called difficult, told she disrupted cohesion. And now, while the paper sat in HR's folder, the very mechanisms that had labeled her were recalibrating. The investor's discretion, elicited perhaps by the Hson artifact and the legal obligation it invoked, had become a lever. Where capital moves, executive certainty follows.
As the board prepared their statement, counsel advised a procedural step the charter allowed, a temporary restriction on executive action pending the review, accompanied by an immediate audit of decisions tied to potential conflicts. It was the kind of technical motion that would, behind the bland words, cut off the charismatic parts of executive authority. Lang would still appear in photos. He would, for now, be a figure with fewer powers. Lang's removal was not a single theatrical ejection. It was a set of administrative unseatings, certain authorities rescinded, committees reconstituted, and the immediate detachment of his capacity to enter into contracts of certain material value. The removal was precise and painful in the same way a surgeon might describe excision: clean, purposive, and leaving scars that would be visible in footnotes for years. When the board's motion reached HR, the office that had prepared to close Rebecca's file found itself recalibrating. The termination letter had been drafted in the morning, but the afternoon's votes required that her status be frozen until council's conclusions. HR's polite script turned into a different kind of script, an administrative hold rather than an exit. Paperwork does not move backward with ease, but governance can demand reconsideration. There was a moment, small, decisive, when Richard Lang realized he had misread the day. He attempted a few last calls, lungs of entitlement laboring to make a case. His voice entreated vendors and allies. He tried to make work see reason, to remind him of past favors, of lunches shared and introductions made. Work listened like a man cataloging debts he believed should be paid by more than memory. In the end, Lang's calls read like the pleading of someone suddenly numeric rather than theatrical. His capital was not persuasion, but data points, and those data points were shifting away from him. Leela's exit was quicker and less ceremonial. As the company reorganized, security escorted her from the floor. Her phone had been silent for an hour, which is to say that the social personality she cultivated had been rendered less useful by a cascade of protocol. She was professional in the way someone who had always been prepared for spotlights is professional when the lights go cold. She collected her coat, forced a smile for a few cameras that happened to be recording lobby movement, and left with her father at her side, their private conversation a muffled thing against the marble. The press would later call it a fall. Internally, people called it a correction. The language changed depending on whether memory wanted to be kind or blunt. For Rebecca, the scale of the change was not celebratory. She had not engineered theatricals. She had pressed an obligation into the light and allowed governance to perform as its charter described. The point mattered to her. The firm had to answer in the language it prized.
If that required uncomfortable minutes and the public diskilling of a man accustomed to deference, so be it. After the motions had been recorded and counsel had their copies, Rebecca was summoned back into Delgado's office. The room that had presided over the documents unsealing hosted now a different conversation, one of stabilizing the organization. Malcolm Brandt sat at the head of the table, a man aged by the slow accumulation of choices he would live with. He had the look of someone who had wanted to avoid this particular calculus, but had ended up being asked nonetheless. "Miss Hson?" Brandt said, voice rough with the weight of someone who had watched a business be everything and sometimes nothing. "We owe you clarity." They offered her a board seat as if it were the inevitable conclusion of historic resolution. It was a polite thing to offer and a politic thing to do, make amends by folding a person back into the center of things. "We'd like you to consider taking up a governance role," Delgado said. "Your family's interest—" "I understand," Rebecca interrupted. She had expected the offer. She had not expected to be tempted. The seat would be powerful in the conventional sense. To accept would be to take a tool and wield it inside the machine she'd just recalibrated. To refuse would be to insist that accountability be the mechanism, not her person. She thought of her father and the often quiet way he resolved crises, not for credit, but for continuity. Edmund Hson had built into the firm a clause that read like an anvil to be dropped when needed. That clause had been read. It had moved power. She owed him fidelity, not a throne. "No," she said, plain and leveled. "I don't want the seat." There was documentation in her refusal, not a dramatized exit, but a formal letter she handed over explaining why. She would not be a symbol. She would be a steward of the principle she wanted honored. "I do not come to take control," she said. "I came to ensure the firm lives up to its charter. If governance must be corrected, let it be corrected by process, not by my elevation." Brandt closed his eyes for a breath that seemed to hold a lifetime of apologies. "You could do so much," he said. "I could," she acknowledged, "but that isn't the point." There was an awkwardness to the offering and refusing, like two people passing a fragile heirloom back and forth in a room that had recently learned how to handle weight.
Rebecca boxed the ring then, placing it inside the small velvet container she'd carried in her bag. She set it on the table and slid it toward Brandt, as if returning an instrument to its owner. He took the box with hands that trembled, in a way only someone who had lost and rescued a thing half their life would understand. "Keep it in our custody," Brandt said, as the charter describes. "If the family insists." She cut him off with a half-smile that was not unkind. "Keep it in the vault the charter specifies."
If it must be used again, make sure it's used by the mechanism, not by men who think names give them exemption. They signed minutes, council filed forms, the company issued a press statement that read, in the kind of corporate cadence designed to call markets, "The board has acted to ensure governance integrity and will continue to uphold the charter. An independent review will commence." Media outlets interpreted the motions with the appetite of shallow commentary. They labeled it scandal, correction, or drama, depending on their audience. For Rebecca, the press was incidental. Once the procedural apparatus had been set and the people in the room had done their part of the ritual, someone in HR asked the question that had begun the morning. "So, your employment status?" It was a practical question. They needed to know whether they were to process her offboarding or preserve it. Paperwork, again, demanded conclusions. Rebecca signed nothing that day and accepted no formal restoration. She wanted nothing to do with being the living sign of a company's contrition. Her work, in her view, had been to make sure the ledger reflected truth. That had been done. The company would have to live with its own corrections. As she walked out of the building that evening, Delgado looked up from her desk and offered a small nod, recognition, not reward. Brandt approached, not with the show of a man hoping to keep her, but with the humility of someone asking her to keep watch. "If you will accept oversight," he said, "help us do better." "I will help," she said, "in the way that does not require me to sit in someone else's chair. I'll advise when asked, quietly." She meant it. The firm needed its processes to learn how to protect itself from its own complacencies. It did not need her to be its marquee apology. Outside, the city had the same indifferent rhythm it had the day before. People were walking dogs, selling coffees, scrolling through updates. Lang's exit, Leela's removal, the investor's recalibration, all would be headlines tomorrow and memories next week. Rebecca felt the odd, private weight of the ring against her palm as she reopened the velvet box and pushed the ring back onto her finger. It fit the way memory fits against a bone. She did not want power. She wanted the ledger to be legible. She heard behind her the click of heels and the soft slap of a courthouse decision being prepared in minutes and files. The firm would have to rebuild trust, appoint new leaders, and show its stakeholders it could answer to its own claimed values. Those were tasks for committees and council, for people with the appetite for governance. Her role, she thought, had been to make sure the book was open. On her way out, an assistant she knew from lower floors, a woman who had once been the subject of Leela's casual cruelty, caught her eye and mouthed the word thank you. People think gratitude and justice are the same. They are not.
But gratitude in that moment was an acknowledgement of relief rather than triumph. Rebecca nodded, small and exact. Lang's downfall was, in the end, less one of spectacular humiliation than of suspended authority. He found himself outside the control rooms he'd cherished, and the company adjusted its language to reflect that. Investors discussed exposures, clients were reassured by new governance, employees who had once believed loyalty meant silence now read minutes and felt seen. The institutional correction would have to be practiced, day after administrative day, to become real. Rebecca walked down the street with the box in her bag. She had not taken the investor in any theatrical sense. Her action had been to present the ledger and let someone with the capacity to act make a decision in the language of capital. The headline that later read, "Top Investor Withdraws," simplified the motion into a dramatic cause and effect. The truth was less cinematic and more procedural. A chain of attention, a clause, counsel advice, and an investor's discretion all aligned. One man's awareness of a worn ring had been the pebble that started the current. Governance and capital did the rest. In the days that followed, the firm rewound its operating procedures. New committees convened. Delgado reasserted a steady hand. Malcolm Brand, who had thought the company a family affair, began to speak in a different key, publicly endorsing a culture of documented fairness. The rumor mills churned. Leela found new employments less glamorous than her last. Richard Lang found, to his surprise, the difficulty of being a former CEO. The world had less patience for apologies than he'd supposed.
Rebecca received, weeks later, a quiet letter from counsel confirming the archive's verification and noting the board's action to preserve the Hson interest as a fiduciary concern. It was the kind of bureaucratic affirmation she liked, clear, documented, and not designed to flatter. She filed it with a small sense of completion. She did not stay to see how the firm would remake itself. Her work was not consolidation, but correction, and correction can be messy over long time frames. She preferred the edges, where systems break and are mended, without living permanently in their center. The box with the ring remained in her bag for a time. Eventually, she mailed it to the vaulted address the charter specified, with an instruction signed in her fine, economical hand, to be handled strictly as provided under charter. Delivering the ring to its prescribed custody felt like closing a loop rather than taking revenge. The ring had been a tool of attention, an artifact that forced men who believed themselves immune to history to account for the past. It had not been magic. It had been an obligation invoked.
On a quiet afternoon a month later, as the firm's stock steadied and the board published its minutes, someone sent Rebecca a photograph, a snapshot of the empty chair laying once occupied. The lighting in the boardroom changed, the nameplate removed. No one had danced on the table. People sent messages of relief, of gratitude, and even of bitterness. Corporate life is many things at once. Rebecca received them like evidence, cataloged them, and then returned to the work she preferred, solving the invisible problems that keep systems functional. When someone asked her later how it had felt to be labeled difficult, she let the answer be a quiet thing. Being difficult had been the firm's shorthand for someone who asked awkward questions and required evidence. In a system preferring narratives of charm, those questions had been disagreeable. But questions, she believed, were necessary. They were the tidy tools that examined ledgers and prevented rot. She never framed the events as a personal victory. The top investor's adjustment had not been hers alone to claim. It had been a